So my theory is if Rolex from the 60s existed now, this Tudor Pelagos 39 is what they would come out with. Today I'm going to talk through my thoughts on the Tudor Pelagos 39. It's going to be pretty in-depth. I'm going to go through how it looks on NATO straps. I know given the increased lug width, the detractors or the things people don't like about it, as well as some of the things I do like about it. I was going to do this review in a couple of videos, but I decided to just make it one video and break it into sections. So if you go down, you can see the sections and skip to the ones you want to talk about. I'm going to first look at how this compares to what I think is the ideal Rolex Submariner and why I think Rolex would make this nowadays if they were still a tool watch oriented company. How this is different than the old Pelagos line and whether or not it's lost its Pelagos DNA. What are the things that I love about this new model and why do I think it's the perfect dive watch for me and probably for anyone who's like me? And what are the things people detract against the Pelagos, this specific model, and how do I feel about those negatives? So if you're new to the channel, I have a love for Rolex of the 80s and 90s, and I particularly like the function of the watch as well as the wearability. I like watches that are a nice sports wearable size. I can wear bigger watches. I typically don't choose to. I prefer things that kind of disappear. And that's a function standpoint. I like to forget that they're on. If you take those best points of the 90s Rolex Submariner and you take the best points of the current Rolex Submariner, you'd essentially come up with a watch that is the Submariner as it is seen today, but slimmed down and more modest in its appeal. Now, I also like the fact that the old bezels weren't as reflective. They weren't as shiny. So in my mind, this Tudor Pelagos 39 is the marriage of those two things. They have some other innovations which, if Rolex was still a tool watch company, they would have adopted. Mainly that it is made out of titanium, that's the big one, and the fact that it has these ceramic lume plots that are set down so they're not flashy. So that's why, for me, this Tudor Pelagos is the ideal dive watch. It has been on my wrist for a very short period of time. I already know that I'm probably not going to want to buy a no-date Submariner anytime soon. Now, I have other Rolexes, so the conversation about whether Tudor or Rolex, which one's a better brand, which one you'd rather wear, that's up to you. I don't give a shit. If it's a Tudor, I love it. If it's a Rolex, I love it. They're different watches and they're different brands. I don't care if it says Rolex on the dial. Now, in terms of DNA of Pelagos line, you're going to look at the origin of the Pelagos line. It started as a 42mm watch with an ETA movement in it. It was always over 14mm thick, so it was a big chunky dive watch. It had 500 meters water resistance and a helium escape valve on the side. The concept being that it was a hard-wearing beat-to-hell tool watch, and that was a big appeal for a lot of people. It was supposed to go against the, deep seas of the Rolex line or the Planet Oceans of Omega. And so that was kind of the niche for the Pelagos line. The biggest departure from the Pelagos line was not this watch, in my opinion, but the FXD. As soon as they moved to the FXD, they lost the rehaut in the actual dial face that they had where it was cut out for each indice. They lost the thickness and it lost the 500 meters water resistance. So it was no longer that beefy, modern tool watch that it was supposed to be. It was now slimmed down. It was now still a tool-oriented watch in terms of its marketing, but it wasn't the same all-capable diver that they were originally proposing. So the concept of water resistance and whether or not it should be a 500-meter water-rated watch is a bit silly to me. So I'm a scuba certified diver, so I can recreationally dive down to 18 meters. That's 60 feet. And that's my limit, or supposed to be my limit. I've gone a little lower on accident a few times, but either way, that's the limit there. If you get an advanced certification, which some of my friends are and I haven't done yet, you can go down to 30 meters in depth. That's 100 feet. Your limit for recreational scuba diving is 40 meters. That's it. You're not able to go any further unless you have technical diving experience. And that is a litany of requirements in terms of number of dives and depths and everything like that. And the max that a human has ever scuba dived is 332 meters. That is the absolute max that any human being has been capable of. And that's, I don't know how many different tanks he had to stage because your body is so compressed at that point that you have to keep waiting in the water as you come up slowly. So my point is, I don't think for me, and I'm going to scuba dive with this watch, that I need something rated at 500 meters. Is it cool and is it marketing and all that? Sure. Now, whether or not this has changed from the Pelagos line because of how Tudor's deciding to market it, that's different. If it makes you feel like it's not a tool watch because the ad doesn't show someone in a scuba suit diving with it, then obviously that's up to you. But that doesn't change the fact that I know I'm going to scuba dive with this, and I know it's going to be what I have in addition to my dive computer. So that would be my thoughts on whether or not it's alienated itself from the Pelagos line. I think it's still very tool-oriented. Whether or not it says Pelagos on the dial, I think is up for interpretation. I think this is essentially a Submariner with modified, materials. But the caveat to that being, when I look down at this and it's on my wrist, it feels like when I had the 42mm Pelagos in. And I look down at this and I remember scootering in Paris with my wife on the first part of our honeymoon because I wore the 42mm Pelagos during that entire first half of the trip. And so when I look down at it, that's exactly the feeling that I get. So it feels like a Pelagos to me. Whether or not you don't like that it says Pelagos on the dial, I guess is kind of the contention there. So what do I like about the watch? This is kind of the review portion of this video, and that's going to be the wearability. I think something I said in a comment a while ago was that I typically buy watches for the design, but I keep watches because of how they wear, because that seems to be, for me, the most important point. If it doesn't wear well, even if it's got a great design, I don't keep it. And so I like a certain style of watch, I like a certain wearability, and this nails all of that. The specs are on the screen, you can see them, and most people already know what they are. You've got a 39mm case, you've got a very thin profile under 12mm, you've got a nice compact lug to lug, which you can imagine. It's got 21mm lug widths, which is a detriment, and I'll get through that a little later. I'll show you it on some NATO straps. It's really light. You can see the weight on the screen in terms of it as just the head of the watch or the bracelet or it with the rubber strap. It's incredibly light. It on the rubber strap I wore on a run this morning and it was perfect. It felt very similar to when I wear my G-Shock on a run. It hugged, it stayed light, and it just wore really well for that, which is what I want. I want to go on a trip and know that I can wear it when I go on some jogs. It's got an adjustable clasp, and that T-fit clasp is really easy to use. It's really functional. It's obviously got the dive extension, which I'll put it through its paces when I get to that point. It's got a nice ceramic bezel. The whole thing's loomed, including the bezel, which I love. I think that's really nice for me. When I am timing something later, it's nice to be able to read it, and I think that's really helpful. Not that that'll help in the scuba section. If I'm not doing night dives, it won't matter. But either way, that's a really nice added feature for me. It's cleaner because it dropped the date, and it obviously has the red text written on there, so it gives you a nice little bump or a little panache, I guess. And it has the burst bezel, which for me is a positive. I really like how it has a little extra something to it. It's not quite as sterile as the 42mm Pelagos, but it's not loud. It's not like the Submariner where that bezel is just screaming at you from across the room, because it's this polished, fingerprint smudged ceramic bezel. If you've had a bezel like that, it collects fingerprints like crazy, and it looks great, but it's not something that I would wear. It's too flashy for me. And so this has just enough of a bump for it to say, hey, I'm here and I'm interesting, but I'm not really that loud. And it turns gray in the light, which I think is a nice, really cool look to the watch. It kind of separates it from the dial a little bit better, so it's not one big mass of black. So what do I not like? Or what are the things, I should say, what are the things that most people are currently discussing and debating and not liking? And I'm going to go through them in a list and kind of what my thoughts are on them and if that helps you at all. So the first one people are not really liking is the burst on the bezel. I already talked about that. I like it. It's just enough of that little flavor for it to make the watch a little more interesting. And it obviously desaturates the color, makes it a little gray, which I think also adds a little extra element to the watch. It's too light. And that's going to be a problem for anyone that has a titanium watch. This watch itself is incredibly light. It's lighter than my 36mm Explorer. It's just surprisingly light. When I picked it up out of the box, I knew it was going to be light, and it still surprised me. So some people will try that on and it won't be the right fit for them. Either they like heavy watches or because they think it feels cheap, and that's fair if that's you, but I like that it's light and I think it vanishes for me, and so it fits a lot better. The lack of thickness or presence and the fact that the rehot is lost. And that's a relatively fair point. Now the thickness, obviously I could do without, but the fact that the rehot is lost, I think it does lose a little bit of that element that I did like about the original Pelagos. Now, I prefer losing it in order to have a thinner case, but I think that that was really well constructed touch that Tudor put on there to make a thicker watch, but to make it feel like it was thick for a reason, to give you that depth. So I kind of do miss a little bit of that, but not nearly enough to trade it back and go for the older version. The water resistance drop, I talked about that earlier. I think it's silly. If it's 200-meter water resistant, it's far more than I'm ever going to need. I'm not doing technical diving. Even if I was, I wouldn't go below 100 meters. I don't really have that in the cards ever. That's a dedication for the rest of your life to diving, and specifically to really highly technical, difficult, low dives. And there are very, very few people in the entire world that need to go below 200 meters. So I'm not ever going to be one of those. The marketing, and I think that's fair. I also touched on this a little bit earlier. I think that some people see something and they want to feel inspired by the way that they're going to use the watch. And I think that's why these YouTube videos are really helpful. When I first got into watches, these YouTube videos helped inspire my own interest in other watches. And so when a marketing video comes out that doesn't really speak to me, like the Pelagos marketing ad, it didn't speak to me at all. I liked the watch because I knew I would like it, and I liked some of the pictures, but the ad itself was confusing and very unusual, although not unusual for Tudor, and it was very fashion oriented. From a business standpoint, I completely understand why they did that. They're targeting a more unisex watch because they know it's going to sell more. If you're going to have the Pelagos, premium, thick 500-meter diver, then you're going to need to play at something different in order to get other people to buy that. Because if you play at the tool watch, then people are going to say, well, it's not quite as tool as this 42, and those buyers are going to buy that 42 anyway. So you need to play to a slightly different market, I think, and so that's why they changed. Plus, I mean, my wife wore this briefly and she enjoyed it. It fit her wrist well. She had tried on the 58 when I had it, and so I think that it does play into that market a little differently, and I think there's a reason behind it. But if that doesn't speak to you, then obviously you can not watch the marketing, or you can just not get the watch, and that's fair. The name Pelagos written on it, again, spoke about that earlier, doesn't bother me. I think of it as a Pelagos because it looks like that to me, especially from side on. When I just look at it briefly and I glance at it, it feels almost the exact same as the other one, except just a tad more wearable. Tudor is an homage company, and that one is going to be pretty contentious. I think if you're in that camp where you kind of despise it because you think that it's a cheap Rolex, then you're never going to buy the watch anyway. So you can either not watch content about Tudor, or you can give other people crap. It doesn't really matter. Point being that, yes, it was originally designed to be an homage company. Their Submariner came out almost at the exact same time as the Rolex Submariner. So it has basically the same length of time of duration of the watch existing. This is a variation on the old Submariner that Tudor made. That was the largest differentiator from the original Submariner. And because this, for me, especially with it being titanium, with the design of the snowflake hands, the square indices, and the overall layout, doesn't feel like it. If you took Tudor off of this and you put a different brand name on here, you'd think, oh, hey, that's a different looking diver from a different company. It's still got the same rotating bezel that every other diver has. It's got a different indice layout. It's made out of titanium. You wouldn't even think to say that it's an homage of a Rolex. So I think this Pelagos, or the Pelagos line in general, is a very far differentiator from the original Rolex Submariner look. So I wouldn't say this is at all a homage, but obviously if the name Tudor on there feels like a homage to you or a cheap Rolex, then don't buy it. It doesn't feel like that to me, and I'll probably collect Tudors from now until I'm dead. I just really like the concept behind the brand, and I like the fact that it's frankly less expensive for a very easily usable and well-built and well-designed watch, the lug width. And this is a shot of the watch on a NATO strap. So you can see when it's got a 20 millimeter NATO in a 21 millimeter lug width, there's a little bit of a gap. I can see the spring bar, and it's not my favorite. I do think that they should have done 20 millimeters. It's not something that obviously will keep me from keeping the watch, but it's kind of a little bit of a bother. I think the fact that it comes with a rubber strap, lessens that a bit for me, because now I'll just wear that on a run instead of a NATO. But I'll need to start adding now 21 millimeter NATOs, because the 20s they're close. And I think you could still wear them and probably forget that it's slightly too small. The last piece is going to be the dial. And people have been concerned and scared about this burst dial. This is a video of the sunburst, so said sunburst dial. It's kind of impossible to see. I have a flashlight aimed at an angle at this watch during this video that I'm showing you right now. That is as much sunburst as I can actually see on the watch. It's almost impossible in normal daylight or normal lighting scenarios to actually see the sunburst at all. So I would not let that hold you back. I have never seen it really walking around on my run. It was very sunny, never even saw it once. In certain lights, what it looks like is somewhere between a matte and a glossy lacquer dial. It's reflective, and the crystal's reflective, but it's not, sunburst. It's not loud. It's not that reflective. It's somewhere in between a glossy lacquer and a matte. It's like a slightly more polished matte dial, I guess, has some serrations that you can kind of see when you tilt a light at the side and a flashlight directly at it. So really hard to describe. Point being, the bezel sunburst is noticeable, and you will see that every time you have harsh light on it, but the dial itself, I would say that's a non-issue. You're gonna have to be standing under some pretty intense light, more so than these studio lights, to actually see that. So if you've made it this far, thanks for making it this far. It was a very long video. I had a lot to say. I love this watch, and I really wanted to kind of take all of the opinions I was hearing out there from a lot of different people and distill them down into one kind of all-encompassing video about this new Pelagos 39mm model. So if the longer video style works for you guys, let me know. I try and be as exhaustive as I can without actually losing people along the way. So just let me know that. And what do you think about the model? Was there something that I missed? Are there things about this that you hate that I didn't touch on, or that you really like that I didn't touch on? Either way, let me know down below. Till the next one, take care.